All right. So, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all attending this event today. In Lake Macquarie, we meet upon the land of the Awabakal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. And wherever you are, I encourage you to take a minute to just give your thoughts in terms of a acknowledgement of the traditional owners of wherever you might find yourself standing. With National Volunteer Week, for those of you who know, or I guess for those of you who don't, what we would usually do is invite people to a Council's Landcare Resource Centre. We would do some award presentations. We would talk about what we'd achieved through the year. There'd usually be a theme around which National Volunteer Week was sort of circulating in that year, and we try and have a bit of a celebration. This year, right from the get-go, we actually wanted to do something new. So we did two things. One is we planned that we would have an event which was around the showing of the 2040 movie, and then a panellist conversation which you're invited to and joining us for tonight. We decided that was starting to get a little old hat. People were doing that. There were movies, shows like Q&A on ABC, that's the format. So we thought we'd go one step further and trigger a pandemic that required everyone to be shut in and force us to go online to deliver this event. So, welcome to not only our first quite untraditional National Volunteer Week, but our first fully online event. Wherever you are, thank you so much for joining us. I think all of us as panellists, and probably a good chunk of you guys out there, are pretty new to this sort of stuff, but it's interesting even in terms of being pretty new. We've probably all kind of been doing it for a few weeks now, engaging online and that sort of stuff. So some of the things that Francis, John and I can see, and possibly you can see it, a number of the participants joining us. So to you 22, thank you for coming along. My wonderful team, as always, have given you the notes to follow so that any errors that are made are mine and mine alone. So I'd like to welcome landcarers from Lake Macquarie Landcare, Hunter Intrepid Landcare, Luscantire Landcare, of which I'm sure John isn't the only rep, Hunter Regional Landcare, which is a larger organisation that we all partner with, and as well as other landcare groups from all over New South Wales, and in particular mention Goulburn and Western Sydney. Now, if Goulburn and Western Sydney reps aren't here with us yet, I'm sorry, you've just missed your nod there. I'd also like to welcome the Mayor of Lake Macquarie, Kay Fraser, who's an extremely vocal and strong supporter of landcare across our area because she appreciates the amazing capabilities of our volunteers across all spheres of council, and in terms of us, always recognise the important work that our natural area volunteers do. And through her entire time, she's always been representing at all of our events. Okay, it's a wonderful honour to have you joining us for our first online event, and don't I feel more nervous up now, noted that you're here. So this year's theme of National Volunteer Week is changing communities, changing lives. Usually I do a good 5 to 7 minute spiel myself about that theme, and I wax lyrical, and I'd probably be working off the cuff. I'm probably not going to do that too much now, except for to sort of put forward that this is really the reason that Lake Macquarie City Council do engage with volunteers so strongly, is that we recognise that as you engage, as you take on stewardship of those natural areas with us, you are not only changing your own life, you're changing the lives of your community and the people around you, and you're changing the city in positive ways. And we want to thank you for coming. Thank you. Whenever we get an opportunity, this is the time of national thanking you. So thank you very much. Right now, I'd like to hand over to our panellists, John Schultz from Gulkula Hereford Farm in Luscantire, and Francis O'Brien, who is the current facilitator of Hunter Intrepid Landcare and the founder of The Seeding. So, John and Francis, give a wave to our audience and say ohio.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
So we know that a lot of people have come to join us to see Damon, who'll be joining us at 6:30. So we've got 3 minutes each, John and Francis, to talk about your backgrounds and what you do. I'm going to kick to you, John, just because screen-wise you're on my left.
Oh, thank you very much, Jason. Hello, everyone out there. I'd like to thank Lake Macquarie Landcare for giving me the opportunity to come on and talk tonight about what we do out here on the farm. We're an 86-acre farm between Maitland and Singleton on the Hunter River. and we farm regeneratively. We try and make the soil work for us. To improve the soil, we improve the plants, which improves the animals. When we come here in 2002, it was very hard soil. Water just ran off it. The pastures weren't very good. And we've tried to turn that around by doing all sorts of things, chemical fertiliser, deep ripping, and none of it seemed to work. A couple of years ago, we went to a lecture in Sydney by a man from America called Joel Salatin. And I came home and started putting into practice what he said, and we noticed a turnaround within 12 months. The soil was a lot moister, the grasses were taller and thicker, and it's just kept improving ever since then. We basically move our cattle every day onto a fresh piece of ground, and then eat out a third, trample a third, and leave a third. So the plants get a good opportunity to renew, and we don't put cattle back onto that ground until those plants have regenerated enough to take another grazing. And that could be anywhere between 40 days and 120 days, depending on the season. We've noticed lots of things like different pasture species coming, fungus taking off, whereas cowpats used to just lie in the paddock and not rot down. Now they either get eaten by the dung beetles, scratched out by our free-range chooks, or they sit there and they're all crumbly and friable and they get eaten by earthworms. So it's been a really big turnaround, but it's something that's really good because it's chemical free. It's less diesel, less fuel, and it's really good food. So that's basically what we're trying to do out here.
And a wonderful example of taking learnings from other areas and reducing that carbon footprint. So it's a really, and obviously we had a bit of a practice run around this, folks, and yeah, I think both Francis and I were really quite keen to learn more about what John does. So Francis, can you please talk to us about both Intrepid Landcare and the seeding?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jason. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today. I'm also on a Awabakal land. I'm in Newcastle. And I'd also like to thank Lake Macquarie Landcare Network for inviting me along today. My name's Francis. I'm an accredited ecologist and also the facilitator of Hunter Intrepid Landcare, which is a mobile youth landcare. I'll probably go into a bit more detail later, but in the short time that I have, basically the idea of Hunter Intrepid is to connect young people to projects, landcare projects that require maybe a younger workforce or more people, and also to support those young people in pursuing their own landcare interests. So I'll probably be talking a little bit later about some of the projects that are springboarded off Hunter Intrepid Landcare. I also founded a collaborative project called The Seeding. The idea of the seeding is basically to bring together environmental organisations across the Greater Newcastle area, although I've had some interest from groups in Lake Macquarie and a bit further afield as well. So bringing those groups together so that they actually talk to each other and can even create projects together. The idea behind that was that there are so many environmental groups out there. I counted about 40 in the greater Newcastle area that are not talking to each other, and I thought that seemed like quite a waste. So I founded the seeding for the purpose of getting those groups to communicate with each other. And it looks like Damon's joined us.
Yeah, well, so thank you for joining us tonight, Damon. So my minders have let me know that you've got some background in John and Francis, so I won't go back and get them to introduce themselves for you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Damon. We're very glad to have you with us. I've watched your movie as homework for this, and I'm sure a couple of others. I'll ask people to put their hands up in the audience if they haven't, so we can scowl a little bit at them. So since we've sort of only able to have you for a limited time, Damon, I'd like to just kick straight off into the questions. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a live chat forum going on here by which questions are going to be put through to us, and there's capacity to vote those up. Now, Alira from the Landcare Resource Centre, in exile at her home, is actually going to be monitoring those and letting me know when we've got some that are really worth having a look at there. But obviously we set ourselves up some Dorothy Dixes to start with, just while people are trying to work out what they'd like to hear and what they want to jump in on. So, Damon, I'm going to start with you. This year's theme for National Volunteer Week is Changing Communities, Changing Lives, which we think fits beautifully with your movie, which is really about those change capacities. What has been the impact of this film? Because I'm certain you've never been asked that before. And what changes have you seen come about as a result of the 2040 regeneration movement?
Well, yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. We set up quite a few different metrics that allowed us to measure the impact of the film. So apart from just doing a cinema release and the conventional iTunes online streaming that you do, we sort of set up a bit of an outreach campaign where we teamed up with about 50 different organisations, created a platform where after people had seen the film, they could go and activate their own plan, and given their preferences and passions and what they resonated with in the film, they could then take action on the things that they'd seen. And to me, that's probably the most rewarding element of this whole experience, is that the solutions we show in the film have been brought to life by the public, who were just clearly looking for outlets or ways to get involved or volunteer or donate their time or money or whatever it might have been. So in that sense, it's been extraordinary. For example, there's a solution about seaweed in the film. And we, through people's generous donations, were able to set up and build the first sort of marine permaculture platform in Storm Bay in Tasmania. And we're working with the University of Tasmania there. And we've got kelp in the water already. They've tied it to some of the fish pens down there, and they're finding that the seaweed's actually absorbing the nitrates that are coming off the fish pens and the ammonia that would have normally ended up in the ocean as it grows, which has been a real bonus. We're about to launch another platform in Devon in the UK, again, just from people's interest in the film. And a few private investors have reached out to us after seeing the film, and they are looking to build their own farms. And one of them is 1,000 hectares as well. And they're just going through the regulatory conditions for that at the moment. And there's even a seaweed industry that's going to start in Australia. So to think a lot of that came about just from people having an idea that sparked has been really lovely. And there's a ton of other things, whether it's the decentralised energy. We raised almost $1 million in an equity crowd fund to make that happen. The Regen Ag story, we work with a group called Carbon8, who you might know of, that actually pays farmers to put carbon back in the soil. They get paid for every percentage, and that's just a payment that the public can make, $8 a month. And probably most rewarding to me has been the teachers. So we've had about 950,000 kids around the country have been taught the curriculum materials for 2040, just to give them a sense of hope, and the solutions are out there. That was the main reason I made the film. So to have the kids respond to it in that way has just been really lovely. So it's been a bizarre journey. Lots of different people have seen it, from ministers, from overseas ministers to world leaders to U2 used some of the clips in one of their stage shows just before COVID. It's been all a bit crazy, and we haven't even opened in the US yet. We open actually next week. We're doing a virtual online tour there, and we've got some wonderful Q&As with really interesting people. So, it's lovely. It just speaks volumes, I think, to people being ready for a different storytelling around these topics, that we've got to motivate people with solutions and inspire them into action, rather than talking about fear and depravity and sacrifice, that we can actually tell a story of the gains that we can get out of making these changes.
I think it's really, I think all of us have identified that, how positive the message is in your movie, as opposed to a lot of other comparative movies, which do tend to try to raise awareness, but can sometimes cause paralysis. And also just, I suppose, a bounce on one of the points you talked about is, it is really interesting, I think, as a world, we're starting to reconsider what volunteer means. And it's not just about those on-ground actual activities, but sometimes it can be about when you lend a shoulder to an actual movement by, let's not talk about protesting because that's too political, but let's talk about crowdfunding, and let's talk about where you provide perhaps governance in terms of the way an organisation might move forward. And they're all areas where you provide your time and your expertise. So, Damon, the next question we've got set up, ready to go before they all start rolling in, is, over the past few months, we've made dramatic changes to the way we live in response to the current human health crisis. What positive changes do you believe are here to stay as a result of those?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I sort of probably felt a little bit more positive only 2 weeks ago, but I think some of what's come out in the last week around some of the decisions it looks like our government's going to make in terms of how we rebuild. I think we had an enormous opportunity to rebuild with smarter, cleaner technologies, but it looks like that our country in particular is going to double down on the old system, and we're sending all the signals that we're going to sort of build large gas infrastructure and try and keep existing coal stations but do carbon capture, which is a shame because most countries around the world are looking at renewables as an investment moving forward just because they've never been cheaper. It's unbelievable, the price now. And also that I think people aren't exactly sure on the ramifications of gas, that even though it's billed as a much cleaner alternative and a transition fuel, the science says that if there's a leak of any more than 2.8% of that gas, which happens at distribution or extraction, that it is actually more deleterious to the environment than coal, because methane is such a stronger heat-trapping gas than carbon dioxide. So BP says there's currently about 3.2% of gas leaks around the world. So it's incredibly harmful. So unfortunately, that message isn't out there. But look, I think overall, I would say that we've all had a chance to reflect and stop and really understand what is important to our society. We've seen the fragility of our system, and we've seen how much excess we have in the system. One of the more disturbing stories I read about was that because of restaurants being closed in the US, they're having to euthanize about 700,000 pigs every week in the US now because of our intense farming practices, which is just a broken system. We've got there's nothing robust about it. We've seen how quickly things fell apart, and that's not a world that I want my children or I think any of us to live in. So I think what it's doing is pushing up this idea of localizing more, creating more resilience in our own communities, whether that's around food or energy, even supply chains, manufacturing. I think that's going to stay. I think that has really shifted things, which has been a positive. And I also feel that even talking to different people and friends that, all the excess that we had, that a lot of us, I think, are realizing we're quite introverted and we don't need to go out and do as much and travel around and be as busy as we wanted before, that it's actually nice and not do much and stay at home and connect with your family and just downsize a bit. And I think that's a really important thing, because a lot of that excess, that lifestyle has been the thing that's been doing the ecological damage. This insane amount of resources that we're consuming that we just can't keep consuming. We're up to about 100 billion metric tons every year, and the Earth can only sustain 50 billion. So we're already double what the Earth can give back. So we have to deal with that in some way. And I think, I hope that that's something that comes out of this, that people are spending more time at work. We're seeing, I think the commercial real estate will take a real hit, that people are realizing they don't need to go into work. There's going to be a lot more working from home, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And we're seeing some really positive stories from countries that are dealing with their air pollution and saying, when we rebuild, we're going to really factor in bikeways and cycle paths and create cities that are less conducive to cars, but promote other ways of transport. And I think that's a really interesting point, that we lose about 7 million people every year from air pollution alone. And some Stanford scientists have predicted that coronavirus might have actually saved more lives than it took in parts of the world, especially China. They predict about 80,000 lives were saved because of the plummeting of air pollution in China. So somewhere I think we're morally obligated to not go back to business as usual. And I think some cities are realising that this is a chance to change things up and keep that air clean. And I just wish that we would do the same here.
I don't think I've had a conversation with anyone about this who doesn't acknowledge that slightly, how wonderful that slower pace is. And has a story about something within their community where they're finding a connection that wasn't there before. Like, we had a neighbour just put a bag of groceries on our front doorstep. We didn't need them. It's a little bit embarrassing in terms of that. But for us, that unbelievable lesson for our kids, that your community can and will do that, and that's not dead yet, and it's not gone forever, was probably, for us, worth the weeks and weeks of the kids jumping on the couch again and again and again. So,
yeah, and I would say too that, the quiet streets and the shut shops and the silent skies actually show us that we do care about each other, that we were able to make a collective sacrifice in a way. No one was really bucking the trend or breaking the rules. There was some care there, and I think we should hold on to that and remember that we actually are. There is an altruistic part of us that comes out when we stop playing the other game, which is the very competitive, extractive game that we've set up. that when that stops, we allow this other part of us to come through. And I hope that the next system we move to, whenever that might be, really values that part of us instead of this sort of more competitive, selfish aspect of us, because we aren't just that. There's a lot more to us than that.
Okay, my director has told me that my voice isn't coming through clearly, so I'm going to try and shout a little bit more, so just bear with me. John, we've seen, both in Australia and overseas, that our reliance on grocery supply chains has become a weak point during the pandemic. Do you think this could drive a shift away from large-scale agriculture and centralised food networks and see us move towards more local, sustainable solutions?
I hope so. That's why I'm here. I was talking to some friends on the Central Coast today who have a business called the Food Farm, and they're run off feet. They can't supply enough eggs, chicken, meat. Everyone wants what they've got, and it's the same in America. Localised farm providing localised customers is really working. If you know your farmer, you know what he does to his produce, you can trust it. I think it's going to be here to stay. There's markets in Maitland that have been running for quite a few years where you can go in and buy your veggies. You can ask the man what he puts on his crops. It's the way to buy our food. You know what you're getting. You see the face of the man. It's not some valueless commodity dumped on a shelf for you to pick up. And it's also, if you're farming like us, it's nutrient dense. And you farm so you're sticking carbon back in the ground. Hello? Someone's after someone. That was a siren.
Yeah, sorry, that's coming through for me. Just give me 1 sec.
It's a raid, Jason.
I love live TV.
That's a sound I haven't heard for a while. That hasn't been the sound of the lockdown, has it?
That's someone with COVID, I think, like running for it, and they've got the boys in blue after them. Yeah, it's great to think that while it was a pretty radical situation to get us into some behaviour change, that hopefully people will realise how much better a farm fresh egg tastes, or your locally produced meat. And it doesn't matter why they make that behavioural change if it, one, makes your sort of programs more sustainable and allows you to carry forward with what are fundamentally far better farming programs and decrease those carbon miles. Really, that's a beautiful outcome in itself. So, Francis, Damon created 2040 motivated by concerns about the planet his daughter would inherit. Could you please tell us how Hunter Intrepid Landcare and other organisations you're involved in, such as The Seeding, are helping to bring the concerns of younger generations to a wider community via different mediums of engagement and storytelling?
Yeah, sure. So I think it would be useful to give a little bit more background about Hunter Intrepid. So as I was saying earlier during my introduction, Hunter Intrepid is a mobile land care group, and our participants are between the ages of 18 and somewhere in the 30s. The upper limit there keeps on creeping up a little bit just because we don't really want to leave. Intrepid Landcare as a whole was originally created when it was made very apparent that generally land carers in Australia are in older generations. And there was a concern that there weren't young people getting more involved in land care. The two co-founders who actually came up with this idea separately from each other and then met each other at a land care conference, came to the realization that it wasn't that young people weren't interested, it's just that they didn't know how to get involved, or that or they viewed land care as something that older people did. So they were interested in the environment and in bush regeneration and that kind of thing, but it didn't feel like there was a space for them. So Intrepid Landcare was created as a sort of overarching organisation across Australia, with the idea that local groups would then be set up. And we've got groups all up and down the East Coast at the moment. So there's, the Gold Coast, and there's some down in Victoria, and there's the Hunter group, and, Western Sydney's got a group. And these have all just sort of popped up as people came to learn about Intrepid Landcare and sort of went, oh, as a young person, I'm interested in bush regeneration and the environment. This sounds like a really great idea. Let's, set up one in this area if there isn't one, or let's get involved with the one that's here. So the Intrepid Landcare groups, they all work a little bit differently, but the basic premise is to get young people into landcare by making it something that's not fixed to one particular site, that has a bit of an element of adventure in it. So I've gone and done kayaking and then creek care, and our Hunter Intrepid group has been doing a collaboration with the Burwood Beach Coast Care group, where we did some planting and then we had a yoga session, and that got really popular. We had a lot of people really interested in that, and then before the whole coronavirus thing happened, we were so pumped to have lots and lots of events organised there, but we'll have to wait a little bit, I think. In addition to that, it's also just really gotten young people who otherwise wouldn't really know how to, I guess, bring their own concepts into reality, a place to speak to other people and get some great ideas, and also to get the confidence to create those projects. So we've had quite a bit of work regarding squirrel gliders. There's been a project that originally was started by another landcare group called Fern Creek Gully Landcare. They're looking to rehabilitate some squirrel glider habitat around the Dudley area, which is a little bit south of Newcastle. And some people from the Hunter Intrepid group found out about it and got really excited about it and started throwing in their ideas. And so now there's going to be a film about the squirrel gliders, which will be really cute. And we also had another member of Hunter Intrepid Landcare who basically created his own project of squirrel glider surveys as well in a completely different area. So I'm getting a bit of a theme here. I think the Hunter Intrepid Landcare group like the squirrel gliders. And, that's just the Hunter Intrepid group. We've got, in Brisbane, there's an Intrepid group there that's been working with the local community to get green spaces and bush regeneration up and going in the city itself. And these are all things that Intrepid really, gave them the confidence and the sort of platform to springboard off. In terms of the seeding, so the seeding has physically only been run once. Obviously with the coronavirus situation, we haven't been able to run it physically. It's going to be happening later on in June online. As I was saying before, the idea of the seeding is to try to bring together all the environmental groups in the greater Newcastle area, and get them to actually talk to each other and collaborate and share resources and that kind of thing. The original event last year was attended by about 30 different groups, so representatives from 30 different groups. Some of them actually came from Lake Macquarie. I've been checking in with those groups and seeing how they've been going, and a lot of them found the experience really useful. They've made contacts with other groups and they're continuing to work together and to share resources. Obviously, some of those things that they planned have been put on hold for now. But it's really been great to actually check back in on them and say, oh yeah, I met such and such at the seeding last year and we're still working on this project together. And yeah, it's been a really fulfilling project to be involved in.
I think when I first was introduced to the concept of Hunter Intrepid or the Intrepid Landcare, that real concept that by throwing like-minded people together that had a desire, if not a vision of where they can help, giving so much opportunity for them to share an idea as a seed and help each other achieve that. That's one of the biggest things I thought was so great about it. Obviously, there's so much advantage to giving a taster for Landcare and so much support for a Landcare group, getting young people enthused about their program. But I think even more importantly is that incubator around a concept and finding the other people that that speaks to, having those conversations. And it's, how do you meet those people? Well, the Intrepid model, and there's so much use of social media or other alternative capture points for those conversations. It was really effective because people already had a passion and an interest, and they just suddenly found themselves surrounded with an audience that felt the same way and could cling or grab to an idea and help make it real.
Yeah, absolutely. Just quickly, Fern Creek Gully Landcare that we've been doing the collaboration with, they were one of those groups that did suffer from having a lower attendance rate and an older workforce, if you like. And since Hunter Intrepid got involved and really got their social media built up, they've got over 100 people on their mailing list now, and there are regularly groups of like 20 people doing volunteer work, which for a Landcare group is big.
Yep.
That's been a really, and you know, a lot of them would be younger people as well. They're really keen.
So the same excitement that I see when seedlings start to sprout up, we're getting some questions coming through. So I'm going to pull one of those up, and I'm going to check that it's not. I'm going to see which one's got the best value for us to discuss here. All right, so around our actual organisation and the one that's got most votes at this point in time with 1 vote, what can Landcare do as an organisation to make the biggest impact on reducing carbon? You know what, I'm going to throw to you for this one first, John, and we'll circle around the table.
I'm biased because I believe that grass is one of the fastest growing. I know kelp's pretty quick. I'm big on the kelp, but on land, grass grows faster than trees. So we can get a grass cycle happening faster than tree cycle. And if we manage our cattle and our sheep correctly, we can put a lot of carbon back into the ground very, very quickly. So one of the functions of land care is sustainable agriculture. Well, there's no such thing as sustainable because that's just keeping as it is and it's buggered. We need to renew it. So regenerative agriculture, managing your livestock, quick turnarounds, long rest periods, putting carbon in the ground, storing water, effective rainfall, that's the way to go. And Landcare is right up there to do that. And that's one of the things I'm hoping we can do out here in our new little group. Get that happening on all those little tiny farms. There's hundreds and hundreds of 100-acre farms. And if everyone looked after the land properly rather than just sticking a horse in a paddock and leaving it there for 10 years, you know, it'd make a big difference. A big difference.
Yeah, that's a very interesting concept about that great capacity to be able to be putting that carbon in the ground. And clearly we need to consider that whole shift away from it being single focused. And you're right, its birthplace is around sustainable agriculture. It was around dealing with the issues of salinity. And that's where Landcare was first born. And it's just found it's got so much application across other areas. When you started talking about that, I was thinking about this dream I've had for ages of like a lawnmower that actually produces its own methane from that. And suddenly I realised that's a cow. It's a cow that's actually a self-sustaining lawnmower. So maybe I need to think more around that. So I'm gonna go to you with the same question. Going to go to you with the same question there, Damon. What can Landcare do as an organisation to make the biggest impact on reducing carbon? Starting with an assumption that you probably know a fair bit about Landcare from your research for the movie and thought, being done, I need to grab the people who haven't thought about this stuff yet.
Yeah, well, I would sort of probably reiterate John's point that there's some pretty stunning figures coming out of certain research around the world now about how much carbon we can put into the soil when you create a mixed environment of animals, grasses and trees. There's a practice in particular called intensive silvopasture. And there are some farmers in Australia already doing it, and it involves a leucaena, which is a legume, and you rotate the animals through that particular crop, but also grow timber and trees within that. And the results that some of these farmers are getting are up to about 26 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, which is just extraordinary when you think that probably a hectare of, say, organic veggies would only be about 1 or 2 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Even rotational grazing, you know, might get you 3 or 4. But once you have this mixed different crops in there, you really start to accelerate the growth. So I'd be really pushing for those kind of practices. In fact, Australia is leading the way in some of those. And most of the farmers I've been speaking to that have improved their carbon in the soil, even the ones that have sort of got from 2 to 6% quite quickly using without animals, all say that once you put animals then into that system, you then can get the soil up to those higher numbers. So this is something we've got to get out there, because I think there is a real binary discussion around animals. It's either vegan or whatever, and I think we've got to really make sure people understand that whether we eat them or not, we need animals on the landscape, and they are pivotal to getting that carbon in the soil and aerating the soil. And it doesn't have to be cattle. It can be, there's really interesting examples of even some of our native animals, the bandicoots, the quolls, the quokkas, these soil engineers that do the same job and really aerate that soil. So the more that we can have these complete ecosystems, it's better for everything. And of course, we're putting that carbon, holding the water, all the things that John mentioned.
Francis, same question. Where do you think Landcare's place sits in terms of reducing impacts of climate change?
Yeah, so I guess in addition to what John and Damon had to say, from the perspective of Hunter Intrepid and the Intrepid group in general, there's a lot of education that needs doing. And that, looks like taking people to areas that need regenerating and showing them what kind of impacts have occurred from, clearing or development of some kind. And then being able to show them that there is something that they can do about that. So in essence, education leads to empowerment. And that's really the thing that Hunter Intrepid and Intrepid in general is trying to do. If we can show people what is, open to them, what they can do, that there are things that people can do as individuals and as groups. And whether that's just, one person planting a tree or, a whole group of people getting together and rehabilitating an entire ecosystem. Those things are available to everyday, ordinary people. And I think sometimes people forget that. They forget that they do have that kind of power. And what's so great about Landcare is that, it's a grassroots organisation, and it's a not-for-profit volunteer organisation, and ordinary everyday people can get involved in that. So yeah, I'm gonna say education there, in addition obviously to what John and Damon had to say.
Yeah. I think I guess from my mind, it's just such a many-strong bow that there's so many different people you can access and so many different concepts. I'm probably going to be a little bit Lake Macquarie centric, I suppose, in terms of this. Assuming you're happy for me to join in the discussion instead of just hosting. I think councils have a great opportunity when working with local communities and Landcare communities, for example, in engaging them in our discussions and progressing plans for greening urban spaces. There's so much that comes in terms of reducing the impact of heat sinks if you put in vertical gardens and green roofs, and all that stuff was addressed in Damon's movie. And the councils are where that rubber hits that road. We have an engagement and communication with the communities. We put together the policies and the processes that can support those things. Sometimes they're our own programs that we're running in our own public spaces. So I think Landcare's got a great opportunity to be a strong part across every city and town in the country of those conversations, working with their local governments. I'm going to have a look what else we have on the question board here. So this is a question to John. Scientists are predicting longer, more severe and more frequent drought in the future. Are the current levels of stocking sustainable into the future? And a similar question relating to cropping. So I guess what we're really asking is what's your thoughts on the current levels of stocking and cropping and moving into the future where you think we should be heading towards? And we'll go around the table with that one. We'll just once again start with John.
Well, because of the drought, there's not a lot of stock left. A lot of stock have been sold off. But stocking must match what's growing on your farm. You can't just say, I'm going to have 30 head of cows run on my 100 acres and that's that. It doesn't work like that. As your pasture decreases, you've got to take animals off. Otherwise, you keep eating into your coverage on the soil and it destroys your soil over time. That's why you'll see paddocks where they stick, I don't know, a couple of horses, or they'll just put all their cows in one paddock for 6 months, and those paddocks just go backwards. And then a couple of years down the track, if they want to keep grass there, they've got to plough it and reseed it and all that expense. And then they do the same thing, and then they've got to do it over and over again. This is why regenerative agriculture is so good. It leaves material in the paddock that can regenerate and be reused and rebuild all the time. Cropping is another thing. Every time you rip into the soil, you destroy soil structure, you destroy all the microbes in the soil, the earthworms, the dung beetles, everything is just tipped upside down and wrecked. The fungi that communicates between plants, it's gone, it's destroyed. And it's absolutely crucial that you keep that stuff in there. Otherwise, you have to pump chemicals into the soil to make the plants grow. They leave paddocks fallow to stop weeds. It blows away in the wind. It washes away in the rain. So it's not the amount that we've got, it's how it's managed. That's what's got to be changed. Leaving bare soil is ridiculous. It doesn't do any good. It heats the atmosphere, you lose your carbon, you lose your water. Running stock continuously in one paddock, it degrades the resource. So this is why we need to teach people, as Francis says, education is really important to get people to change how they do things. And the good point about changing is it's a lot cheaper to do it this way. A lot less money for chemicals and fertilisers. It's better for the environment because you don't have that nitrogen washing off into rivers. It's better for councils because you don't have flooding. That water's absorbed in the soil before it gets to a level where it causes damage downstream. So they're my thoughts.
Damon, over to you. Again, I'm just going to say that what you were talking about in terms of like the disposing of the pigs because of the restaurant industry down. And I guess it's such a challenge to also think at the same time, you have hungry people in that country and you've got homeless people, and there's never a thought given to the capacity to instead consider that a suddenly available resource and be more human about what you're doing with other human beings.
That's right, and it's easy for people to blame the farmers in that situation, but to understand that they're all under a contract. It's not the farmer themselves. They have to meet a certain amount and provide for that contractor, and it's the same in our own country, you know. So I think, you know, we do need an overhaul. Here's a great opportunity. We've got to create a 21st century model to deal with 21st century problems, because we're trying to apply this old model, this 20th century model, for the problems that we have now, and they're just not working. It's not applicable. So we are going to see more droughts, as John and the question alluded to. So, you know, how do we drought-proof our farms and fireproof them and make them more resilient? And that key element is to hold that water in the soil. It's just the most important thing we can do right now. And, you know, again, those stats are amazing. Every 1% of carbon that you add to 30 centimetres of soil, there's about 150,000 litres of water on every rainfall that gets held there. So I remember I recently spent some time with Walter Yene, who you might know, who's a wonderful soil scientist, and he broke it down beautifully for me. He said if you condensed every rainfall in Australia to just 100 drops, that about 36 of those drops go into transpiration for the trees to use. About 2 of those drops go into our dams, but 50 of those drops wash away or evaporate. So those 50 drops are the ones we need to hold on to and put them into the land. Because even we've got our government now talking about doubling the amount of dams. That's only going to catch 4 drops. What we've got to do is get that carbon and organic matter back into the soil, and that's how we'll really irrigate these and drought-proof these farms. So, you know, it couldn't be more important to have this conversation right now. And as John said, it's now economically more viable. There is robust studies showing that once you're using less chemicals, there's a higher market value, that you're actually going to be saving money by switching to those practices. Plus, you get all these other cascading benefits that a thriving ecosystem provides. So, you know, now's the time for action. You know, and we just, as you said, the education piece is important. It's tough for farmers. They don't want to take that risk. They've been told a different story by agronomists and everyone else for a long time, and it's hard to make that change. So how do we help them? How do we educate them? And how do we fund their transition so it's less risky so that we get there faster?
As a bunch of clever monkeys, we find it really hard to move away from the engineering answer to every single problem that we're faced with.
Yeah.
So, Francis, your thoughts about stocking and cropping across the country. Where would you like to see us going? And across the world, of course.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about across the world, but, you know, Intrepid Landcare has done a fair bit of work with local Indigenous communities. And so I might take a little bit of a different angle here. it's been really interesting to hear about traditional Indigenous farming practices and the amazing food resources that already exist in our native flora and fauna. For example, the kangaroo grass Thermidor triandra, that was used as a cereal crop by Indigenous people. And it's a native grass. It doesn't need as much water as, you know, imported rice does. They used to plant huge swathes of it that could support communities of thousands of people. There are, you know, native plants that are available here in Australia that are so much obviously more suited to our drier landscape that could be the potential food crops of the future. You know, there's, you know, things like say kangaroo as livestock or emus, you know, those kinds of things. There are native alternatives that have been discussed, and some things, you know, there's definitely a bit of interest happening there. At the moment, there's a little bit of, I guess, you know, the elite restaurants are kind of getting in on it. They're seeing the bush foods as something, you know, kind of quirky and different, and those things could easily actually become, you know, more widely available for the general public. One of my big passions is actually bush tucker, and I love taking people on bush tucker tours and talking to Indigenous people, traditional owners, about the bush tuckers of their areas. And some of the things have so many nutrients in them, so much more than the industrialized crops that are produced. You sort of go, why hasn't anybody, you know, honed in on this? This is a great opportunity. Yeah, so, you know, in terms of the cropping and stocking, I think it might be worthwhile looking at the alternatives that are right here in Australia.
I think it's an interesting kind of challenge that you've already sort of noted, that it's often those higher level restaurants that start to introduce those. And I think that's got the concern that it creates the paradox where all of a sudden we are seeing those alternatives get out, but they get priced outside of the market and they become such a specialty food that they're suddenly there's no longer an opportunity for them to be mainstream. And I think another great example of that would be shows like MasterChef, where all of a sudden, you know, we're watching our salt marsh species get decimated because somebody sprinkles it on a bit of beef and everyone's like, ooh, it's amazing. And we do need to be smarter monkeys in terms of how we actually use these things to feed people and not always turn a profit. I think I saw your hand, John, starting to try and shoot up when we started talking about native grasses. I suspect you've probably got them in a couple of corners of your reserve there and support them to do their thing.
We've got a lot of native grasses and they're the best thing ever. Found some kangaroo grass growing in a paddock today where I hadn't seen it before. We've got native legumes, red grass everywhere, which is colonising grass, comes in first. Weeping grass, wheatgrass, Queensland bluegrass, heaps and heaps of it. And it's the best grass because in a drought, it goes dormant, but as soon as it rains, it just springs away faster than anything else. So we got saved this year by a grass called liverseed grass, which is another native. It's only an annual, but boy, it come away and gave the cows a feed before anything else did. So I love native grasses. They're the best thing going.
Well, it's hard to beat diversity, and it's hard to beat something that's really meant to be there. Damon, it's fantastic having you. It's understand you've got another appointment at 7:15, unless you want to, I don't know, stand them up or something like that. But we wanted to sort of just throw a last question to you. So you've got, 8 minutes to run through that one. I saw you speak at the Stories for Climate Action event documentary, the Australia Foundation last week, and you spoke about how many artists have been stranded or even abandoned in terms of the pandemic. And the responses we're seeing, not just from our government, but I guess how much their art, their industry relies on audience is kind of crippling to what they've done. But you talked about their opportunity to change the narrative of the way they narrate. How do you reckon landcare communities can use this time to foster engagement and to achieve positive environmental social outcomes by selling their stories and selling them differently into different audiences?
Yeah, well, obviously, narrative's a big one for me, like being a filmmaker. And I think that, we live in a world of stories. We're a species that's evolved to tell stories. And that's how we sort of shape our society. And in this country in particular, we have a very concentrated media landscape, a concentrated group of storytellers that have a certain interest. And I think this is the time where we've really got to be strategic with the stories we tell to cut through that. And I think that because people are so saturated with the negative stories of how bad things are, there's sort of the shock story kind of worked maybe 15, 20 years ago. But I think our capacity for that has changed. That a lot of psychologists I spoke to researching the film talk about this window of tolerance that we have. And there's only so much that we can contain in that window before we disengage, and it all just becomes too much and it's too existential and it's overwhelming. So I think we've got to be smarter in terms of bringing people into these stories and getting them motivated by the solutions narrative as opposed to the sort of the negative story. And that's not to say you shy away from that story, but you frame your entire story in a solutions narrative. So you still say how bad things are, but you don't take up the whole story with that. You use that as a small introduction and then you go into the solution. And we've certainly found that people are ready for that. They're just too full of the other stuff. So we've just got to find ways to excite them, inspire them. Again, talk about the opportunities, as we've discussed. Look at the benefits that you get when you start regenerating these landscapes. Look at the benefits to our own health, to the food, to the water, to the ecosystems. They're the exciting stories we should be telling, not the constant stories about how we're taking that away, because there is enough of that. So I really do think it's a moment for anyone to really be strategic and think about how you're telling your story. How do you cut through in a world that is very concentrated and hard to get through? And for these artists, now is the time to contribute to culture. I think we've left it too much to scientists, and that's not the scientists' fault, but they are trained to speak in graphs and data and logic, and they're very good at that. But the rest of us struggle with that. So I think we've got to find ways of disseminating that information, making it more accessible and exciting. And songwriters and storytellers and artists and poets, whoever it might be, actually contribute these stories more than ever into culture, because that's how we'll bring people on and that's how we'll get through. Because we didn't evolve to read graphs, we evolved to tell stories.
Damon, thank you for answering quickly, because that gives us time for another one.
No worries.
Which I'm going to try and put as sensitively. Why do you choose not to address global population growth in 2040? Do you think that it's possible to achieve solutions without it having a seat on the bus, or was there something specific in terms of your thought process around why you went the direction you did?
No, I did put it in there. I'm not sure. You might have fallen asleep before you got to that part, Jason. But that was about just over an hour in. We look at, so Project Drawdown's number 6 and 7 solution are educating girls and reproductive health services. So when you combine those two, it's actually the number one solution. So the statistics show that there's about 120 million girls in developed and developing nations that don't get access to finish their school for a host of reasons, from religious to work. And if they're able to complete their education, they get to choose when and how many children they have. And that number is about 2. But if they get pulled out of school prematurely, that number's about 5 or more. So if they're given that education, plus the reproductive health opportunities, like legitimate ones, plus work, then the population, according to the UN, is going to come down by 1 billion people by 2050. So just from empowering girls and women. So that's something we should be doing anyway. What a wonderful thing, because it would transform society. But the bonus is also on the climate and our resource use. But I would also say that sometimes what doesn't get articulated clearly in the population debate is that, the people that are having these huge numbers of children in these developing countries, if you look at their resource consumption, it's about 2 metric tons of resources per person. We're up to 27 or 28 tons. So they're not really the ones that are creating the impact on the planet to a degree. I think we've got to look at the excess that we use and this mass consumption. And do we need multiple cars and multiple screens and devices and the amount of clothes we're buying? I mean, a report came out last week that said now 10% of our global emissions comes from fast fashion alone. So really, it's a combination. We have enough resources, enough food to feed 10 billion people easily, organically, on enough land. There's no doubt about that. But our system is so inefficient, as we've been seeing with COVID, that's the problem. I think we've just got a broken system. There's so much waste, from food to energy, all sorts of things. We're just not using our resources in the best way we could be. So yes, less people would be helpful, but I think what's more important is to actually use our resources in a more intelligent way.
Lovely. I didn't fall asleep through that bit. It was actually one of the, I think in a lot of ways, most powerful bits. We watched that movie with my 8 and 6-year-old son, and they sat through it. So that's kudos to you as a storyteller. At that point, I think you really opened up my 8-year-old son to what it might mean to be a girl living a different life in a different country, because he kind of really sort of, you can tell when he's internalized something and he's taken on a message, and it's challenging his worldview, and that it looked like that happened within there. So that was, I think, that was actually one of the strongest messages within there, that impact that can have. Yeah. And it goes to the same thing. Why should we be doing the right thing? Because it will save us as a species, instead of because it's just the right thing to do.
That's right.
Damon, it's been fantastic having you with us. John and Francis, you've got 10 seconds each to throw a question at Damon, and he's got 5 seconds to answer it.
I can go over it, fine.
Damon, are you aware of Rachel Brown's project?
I am. Rachel Ward, you mean?
Rachel Ward. Sorry.
Yeah, I did a farm visit down at Braidwood with Martin Royds just before all the chaos. And we had it was great to see so many people there for the farm visit. It was just after the fires, and Rachel was there doing filming at the time. And I know about 3 different regen ag films that are being made in Australia at the moment, which is just wonderful.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Francis, he's willing to go over. Hit him up with something. This could be your last chance ever.
No, I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that I showed the film to my parents as well, and that certainly educated them a fair bit. And yeah, actually, the bit about women and reproduction and that kind of thing, that really got my dad. He didn't really think about that, and I was sort of, yep, that's how it is. So thanks very much for that.
My pleasure, and thanks for the work you're doing, Francis. I get so buoyed and hopeful by what your generation's doing, and the passion and how articulate you all are on this stuff. It really gives me hope for my daughter's future. So keep up the good work.
Thank you.
So what's next for you, Damon?
Okay,
what's the next story you want to share with us?
Can you tell
us yet?
Yeah, no, there's a lot still happening in this space, obviously. Lots of exciting things, and I'm working on, so Paul Hawken, who was in the film, who wrote Project Drawdown, him and I are doing something together at the moment. He's got a new book called Regeneration that's about to come out, which is a whole raft of more solutions, and we're doing a series and a bit of a platform on that, which is quite exciting. We've got some really great people there. And I'm working on a project actually called Regenerating Australia, and it's actually setting up a vision like 2040, but what Australia might be in 2030. And we're doing a big listening piece at the moment and going around the country and talking to people and asking them what's this next chapter for Australia? What does it look like? And what do we want to be proud of as Australians, which includes using the land and how do we use it properly, and the jobs we want to create, and really trying to get a cross-section of opinions and then create a bit of a vision like I did for 2040 and hopefully get people excited by that.
I've got a question for all you guys. Start with you, Damon, in case you do have to bolt. At your age now, what would you say to your about 16 or 17-year-old self?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'd say the next 15 years of your life are going to be really good fun, and you're going to have some good times, but ultimately they're going to be pretty meaningless. So just get it out of the way for a couple of years and then get cracking in your early 20s.
Francis, what about you?
I would probably say that things are about to get very interesting. I started my environmental activism when I was 17. So, if it's just before then, I'll be saying, yep, things will get very interesting. I'll definitely be challenged, but everything that I have done was worth it, and I don't regret anything that I've done since I started getting involved in environmental activism when I was 17. So mostly it would probably be a warning that I would have to be resilient and really dig down, but no regrets.
Excellent. What about you, Joan?
tough one. When I went through high school, I thought we were all a bunch of very clever people and we were learning about pollution and things like that. And I thought we were the generation to change the world. And yet we've been the generation to do nothing. Our politicians are our age group and they're the worst bunch of bludgers we've ever got. You know, if I was back then, I'd kick myself in the arse and say, have a go, get into it, change this now. Don't let them stop you. Because 30, 40 years has rolled past and we're nowhere near where we've got to be.
No.
Nowhere.
Yeah.
So it's time to make a change now. Really is.
Yeah.
60 harvests left.
That's right.
That's what they say.
Mm-hmm.
What's the 60 harvests left reference, please?
Well, the way the soil is being eroded by wind and rain, how the soil is being destroyed, they've estimated that there are 60 harvests left in the world's soils before the soil is completely defunct and won't support anything.
Yeah.
Which I hadn't asked.
Yeah.
I'm doing what I can.
No, it goes back to that stuff about sometimes really powerful messages need to be shared and they need to be renewed. We can't keep going over the same old, when we run out of plants and food and soil, you realise you can't eat money because it loses, it's that shop window stuff you talked about, Damon, it loses impact. And we need to be aware of those challenges because you don't put the brakes on until you realise you're going too fast. And sometimes it needs to be put into a highly simplified statement that challenges people to ask the question, what do you mean 60 harvests?
That's right.
And listen to an answer and try and internally process it and then carry on with a teleconference. Damon, what would you like?
But you say, here's the deal, we've got 60 harvests left, but here's the amazing things we can do to repair that soil. And then you tell that story. Yeah. And that's how we've got to reframe our storytelling.
Yeah, there's
good
nothing
thing about it too, Damon. Sorry, the good thing about it is a lot of these smart guys in the regenerative ag are here in Australia.
That's right.
We've got some really smart guys in regen ag here in Australia, and a lot of them are tied up in land care as well.
Yeah.
So we have the resources, and we have the know-how. We've just got to get that message out.
Yeah.
Do you attend land care conferences at all, Damon?
I don't, but I'm part of a regen ag group up where I live, and there is a Brunswick Valley Landcare group up here with Pete, and so he's often at those meetings, and there's some really exciting things happening where I'm living.
I've never come away from one of those conferences without being excited about something, and despite my own background being natural ecosystems and bushland restoration, more often than not, they actually do sit in that sphere of regenerative agriculture. Yeah. I guess because it's different and novel in terms of that, and there's so much more capacity for change.
Yeah.
Damon, have you got a question you'd like to ask us while you've got us here?
I do have to jump off, mate. I've been given the warning. They're waiting for me in the next call, so I am sorry, but thank you. It's been really lovely.
Thank you, sir.
Let's keep it up and keep telling the stories, and stay in touch.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a great night. Bye. And then there were three. So, you guys, I assume, are good to hang around with me a bit longer?
Yeah, a little bit.
Why not?
All right, so we're going to have a look through the questions here, and they pretty much sit along that same line. We kind of chatted about them before, but let's run through it again. What do you reckon are the biggest environmental opportunities and challenges brought around by COVID? So we talked about the opportunities, and we talked about how they might make people rethink their food supply chains. What do you think environmental challenges that have been kicked out through this and how they've negatively changed our life? It's so easy to think of the positives, but how do you think they've negatively changed that might make us want to consider a better world where we have a quieter time and more time with the families and lower carbon output, but that stuff we don't want to do?
You go first, Francis.
We're stalling for time, hey? I guess
don't move quick.
The first thing that sort of popped into my mind was sort of locally, obviously people haven't been able to get out so much. And that's meant that our Landcare volunteering expeditions and, you know, just plant ID walks and that kind of thing, we've had to cancel all of those things. So, you know, the whole, in order to be able to safely social distance from each other, we can't then take on these collaborative outdoor projects. That was, you know, the first thing I sort of thought of. You know, there has been some sort of flip-flopping around whether our CO2 emissions have actually decreased as well. You know, there's been, I've seen conflicting reports about this. Some say that because there's so much less travel, there's been less CO2 emissions. Others are saying that, well, actually a lot of these emissions are coming from industry that continues to operate because we use those systems to stay alive, and we're still consuming. We're just locked up inside. So I don't know if that's really necessarily a challenge, but it's something that we really need to keep an eye on when it comes to where our emissions coming from, you know. And definitely we're learning a lot of very interesting things with the COVID situation. Those were my, you know, first thoughts.
You ready yet, John, or do you want me to come have a bit of a go?
Well, no, Francis has prompted me. Out here we have a wild dog problem, and face-to-face meetings have been a no-go. So we haven't been able to be trained up to take chemical baits and bait for dogs out here. So that's going to put a whole kibosh in our program, which is detrimental to the environment too. When we get echidnas, we have sugar gliders out here, other possums, birds, so foxes and dogs, and even cats. Look, cats aren't there for the baits, but there are areas where cats have got to be trapped too. All that stuff's been put on hold. So our environment is suffering because we're not out there actively trying to manage our environments.
I guess for me, one of those concerns is that while it was mind-blowing to watch how early at government levels responses and how many of those responses to protecting people and protecting their lifestyles are actually really positive actions, and like making sure people had money, had a living wage, and were going to transition. And the concern is so much of the dialogue, as we sort of talked about earlier, is around harnessing the reactivation of our economy on business as usual and turbocharging it. And it seems to be providing, probably risking my role here in terms of being attached to council, but kind of harnessing restoration and, rebooting the economy around business as usual and using it as an opportunity to move forward with business as usual rather than grabbing the bull by the horns and using it as an opportunity to change our lifestyle. While it brought those wonderful stories of communities connecting in ways they never had before and finding new joys with top of the shelf games that you're suddenly playing with family again, it also really provided a smoke screen for other activities. We stopped looking at anything, the news stopped reporting anything except for the numbers and what they're doing in that country over there and what's happening. So I guess for mine, it's a big chunk around the what it did in terms of the smoke screen and how much of a distraction it might have been from seeing those opportunities. So the next question really sits along that same line. It talks about how do we, maintain keeping cars off the road as has occurred. Super quick thoughts on that, guys. How would you keep our cars off the road?
How would I keep cars off the road? Or how, I've got no idea. And I noticed when this started, there was very, very few cars driving through Lochinvale if I had to go in and pick up a meal in there. But now it seems like it's back to normal. I don't think it's a case of keeping them off the road. They are back. Yeah. It's too late.
The opportunities sort of
business is huge.
It's hard to keep a population sort of restrained for a long period of time and not have them bounce back. What are your thoughts, Francis?
I guess the only thing, the first thing I thought of was a story that I heard from a city in South America somewhere. Can't remember which city exactly. But there was basically a community action to take back the streets for people to use and not cars. The way that they did that was when the machinery came in to lay down a road and allow cars through what used to be a sort of pedestrian area. They filled it with the local children, and they were all playing in the street and drawing on the footpath and generally having a great time. And you can't really run a bulldozer through that. And they did it for long enough and had enough popular support that eventually it just got left as a community space for pedestrians only. Not suggesting that anybody should do that, but
No, we told them to go back to school if that was happening.
It's a cute little story though, and as far as I'm aware, that city has, the community was really empowered by that, and went on to create a whole bunch more sustainable and community-minded projects in that one city. So.
I guess that's that trigger point for that community, seeing some change and also using the whole passive opposition quite successfully there. So John, we've gone through a drought quite recently and really interested to know how your farm actually fared through that.
Well, we didn't do too bad. Our grass, the natives, and the grass we got in the soil and the way we manage it, did really well. We had longer on the ground than anyone else around us. We had an extra couple of weeks, I'd say. When the drought ended, rains came, we had feed before anyone else, simply because of the way our soil could hold water. When you have a drought, your soil becomes a bit water dispersive initially, and you could see water running off other places, whereas on our place it wasn't, because of all that mulch and ground cover and root holes and worm holes, whatever else is in there, plus the carbon that we've got in the soil, it was able to absorb the water, so we got a kick start. We had a little bit of a problem. I wanted to hang on to cows a lot longer than I should have, and that created issues, but I've learnt my lesson there. We're down to about 12 cows now, and things are looking a lot better. When people were buying feed, we had feed because we make our own hay, and we didn't have to buy anything right up until the very end. And that's when we had to buy some hay. But we did a lot better than a lot of people.
Yeah, there's certainly other people in a worse situation. Francis, what's the next big thing for either the seeding or Hunter Intrepid that's really got you going and focused?
So in terms of Intrepid Landcare, there's actually an online conference. Usually each year we would have a retreat, so we would get out and camp for 3 days. Everybody gets together, gets to have a chat with each other, does some workshops to learn how to do project management and spruiking even. Obviously we can't do that this year, so it's going online, and that's open for land carers to attend, obviously with a focus on those who are between the ages of 18 and somewhere in their 30s. In terms of the seeding, so as I was saying earlier, the seeding is going online this year as well, and that's happening at the end of June. So at the moment, I'm just finalising what platform we're going to be using to try and best facilitate discussions between the different groups. So that'll be the 27th of June, and this time there's going to be some facilitated discussions around 8 different topics, so things like biodiversity and fire and transport and those kinds of things. Although it was initially created as a gathering between Newcastle groups, it's definitely spread further afield, and I've had interest from the sustainable neighbourhoods group in Charlestown and those areas. So I guess anyone's really welcome to attend, and it's just going to be a space where everybody can talk together and come up with some great ideas.
And I think that discussion is so critical to finding like-minded people and getting momentum and getting excited, not just about other people's ideas, but having them, your own ideas reflected back and re-engaging with them. John and Francis, thank you so much for being with us for our first ever online event. I'm pretty pleased with how it's run. I think it was reasonably smooth, all things considered. Before you guys go, while we've still got an audience, because I'll bolt the second you two go, I'd like to thank Hunter Regional Landcare Network, who provided the funding to allow us to run this event and were very supportive when we had to change step midstream and move towards the online version from the crowding and packing middle of walls version. Thank you, John, so much for sharing your stories about your farm. We wish you all success. If we were to go on, I think even just personally, I'd have a lot of questions I'd love to ask you and talk more about. Likewise, Francis, I'd love to be able to have a chat with you longer. If this is something we do in the future, it'd be great possible to have you both involved in future panel discussions. So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in with us who did and stuck it through to the end. And hope to see you at another session soon. Thanks very much, everybody.